Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Rookery's Archives. My name is Louise, I'm also known as the Nerdy Archer, and here in our virtual library we delve into the history and lore of the Assassin's Creed franchise. I am your host and you could call me your archivist. I've been playing a lot of Valhalla recently, hoping to try and finish the main game before the end of 2020. But nearly 100 hours into my save file, I have barely scratched the surface of what the game has to show me and its vast world. There is so much detail in its history that I keep coming sidetracked with how many levels there are to each piece of history and archaeology there is to uncover. But if you're like me and did some research into both the history and pop culture depictions of the Viking period, i.e. you binge a television series, read all you could manage, whether it's horrible histories, The Last Kingdom, or even Vikings and more, you might have noticed one recurring, let's say, class of warrior which turns up again and again in tales and folklore of the period. The Shieldmaiden. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Besides the Horn's helmet and Thor's famed Mjolnir, this is perhaps one of the most romanticised concepts of the period and of its culture, to the extent that, though unconfirmed and with discussions still ongoing within the world of historical research and archaeology, the dev team at AC Valhalla included them within the game because rule of cool. They are so synonymous with this period that they were just added in anyway, and I think that's a really cool concept. Of course, like with Odyssey, it's entirely possible to have an entire set of Jomsviking who are women, though without the Amazon Brigade achievement that we were given in the 2018 title. Eivor herself is shown to fight with just as much ferocity as male counterparts, and her mother Rosta proved quite a markswoman in the prologue Valhalla when we see her fight. And this does not even go into the more spoilery aspects of female fighters exhibited during our 9th century saga. I am so glad that they added in the concept of Shieldmaidens for the game. Growing up on some of the stories which get their influences from Norse sagas and myths, it's just how I was raised, it's how I learned about the Norse period and Vikings in general. Semi-relevant fun fact, the meaning of the name Louise is female warrior. It fits in quite well, don't you think? The most famous two from pop culture nowadays are probably Éowyn from Lord of the Rings and Lagartha from Vikings. But Shieldmaidens have been a feature of pop culture surrounding the Vikings for centuries. From classical artwork to opera and sculpture and other visual mediums, the depiction of Shieldmaidens are everywhere. It just so happens that the duo of Éowyn and Lagartha are the two that we most associate with Shieldmaidens and that aspect in our sort of nerdier 21st century society. As touched upon before, it is highly debated whether Shieldmaidens existed, and historical scholars reside on either side of the argument even now. Some say there is not enough physical evidence or detail about this military side of women in the Viking society, while others are adamant that they were still around. I'm heavily on the side of saying that they did exist, perhaps not in as strong numbers or an official Shieldmaiden hierarchy as one would equate to the Amazons or Hunters of Artemis. They would have been around in some capacity. And yes, most are examples here are mythical, perhaps due to the way that stories were passed down between society and generations. This would be the easiest way to get around stuff in a society where few people, if any, were literate. The influence of conflict in the roles of Norse goddesses is also something to note, as it allows a look at the influence of what was important in Viking culture. For example, the Mesopotamian civilization was agriculturally based, and so many of its gods are associated with that in some way. Freyja was both goddess of love and war, and one of her names, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, I'm so sorry, Valkyfreya. Ea was described in sources as a goddess for healing and medicine, but was also sometimes classed among the Valkyrie. And actual female warriors may have been an influence on the stories of the Valkyries too, these mythical beings taking the fallen warriors from battlefield to Valhalla. Britt-Mari Näsström, called Volfanger, the other hall where half of fallen Vikings were said to go, if not to Valhalla, was a place for the women who had suffered a valiant death to go instead. Comparisons and similar stories to that of Shieldmaidens exist in many other cultures. We've already touched upon Amazons, but in the Germanic peoples and other nomadic cultures in East Europe and in Asia did have structures in their societies where women could hunt and fight in battle. And let's not forget Artemisia from the 5th century BCE, who fought in the Battle of Salamis, and was said to be Xerxes' favourite commander, or Zenobia, whom the Historia Augusta said, and quote, "In the opinion of many, she was held to be more brave than her husband." And there are plenty of tales of Viking women kicking butt too. From Sigrid the Haughty and Freydis Eriksdotter, there are records in the sagas which survive to the 21st century of women taking up arms both offensive and defensively. Additionally, there have been archaeological sites and records where women received a warrior's burial, heading into the afterlife with their weapons and shields close by. The recent retesting of the excavation in Burka is perhaps most notable in the previous few years. The chieftain that was interred there, once believed a male warrior, was tested again in 2017 and revealed to be a woman. Stories ring out with elements of truth, even the fictional and mythological ones. We reflect our own societies and cultures within the tales we spin, and I like to think that those about Shieldmaidens or the Valkyrie, these strong legions of women, showed that they were around in some capacity, perhaps as something like a forewarning to others. There is some archaeological evidence to back up the precedent too, even when one considers that it could be the exception rather than the rule. On the other hand, Judith Desch sees the myth of the Shieldmaiden as something akin to the idealised version of womanhood around the Vikings, in a way that's something they must attain to rather than what they are. Which is an interesting point to note because not every woman is going to follow the same path of their society. Like, I am archaeological based, I play video games, but like my friend might be something different. They might have an interest in sciences instead. Not every woman's path in a society is going to be the same, so it would be difficult to generalise everything around it. Particularly when we don't have as much evidence as we do about the period compared to, say, World War One or the Victorian era. Some Viking women may have made their career as a sellsword, a professional shield maiden, and others might have only taken up arms during specific circumstances, returning to the simple, quiet life back at their settlements when it's done. But this concept of the shield maiden still remains today, as does the impact of women in combat. There was no precedent for women in the military until very recently, and yet there have been records of them still serving. Would we have seen a particular focus on development of the Russian bombing squad in World War II dubbed the Night Witches before their infamous acts? I don't think so. Do we know why they were compelled to fight each individual? Unlikely, as much as we can assume some of it from culture and writings. We may not know. And as I may have mentioned in my Lydia Fry video, women in World War One lied on enlistment forms dressed up as men to fight instead. And Joan of Arc is infamous for being this military figure in France. And even if they didn't physically fight on a battlefield like Jeanne de Clisson, they still rallied, they still exhibited ideas of the shield maiden that we might extrapolate to women in combat or in a military profession, just not on a field of battle. And hey, if anything in this episode has not convinced you, this is a series primarily based on historical fiction that very nearly included time travel in its earliest elements. The history which it depicts and talks about might not always be the, quote, mainstream or classically accepted approach or with newer research. Having a fight with the Pope in the Vatican during AC2 was heavily reliant on the proverbial rule of cool unfolding, and people arguably watched Lagartha kick butt in the Vikings TV show for the same reason, even though she was only mentioned in the sagas once. Artistic licenses may be used from time to time, whether for marketing reasons or to include a people or idea into a time period which pop culture has made us believe it really existed. I'm looking at you, horned Viking helmets. Just because Eivor, Randvi, and Soma exhibit these traits does not necessarily mean they're a fiction. Perhaps exaggerated for the purposes of a game, but historically, these women were not alone on the battlefield. Their names may not be generally recorded, they may not be this structure which we base upon an entire civilization, but they were there, they existed. Women fight in different ways, and I'm really glad that we can see it in Valhalla. I hope you enjoyed this episode on Shield Maidens here at the Rookery's Archives. It's a topic that I'm very, very interested in, and it actually comes up quite a lot when you see discussions about the Viking period, so I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. Comment down below if maybe I persuaded you to think something differently. Have you always thought that Shield Maidens have been a part? Do you disagree with me, and for what reason? I'm curious to know. As always, a reference list and further reading suggestions are in the description below if you would like to know more about the topic from the podcast today. This episode will be the last one for 2020, and the episode 6 will be the first re-released in the new year, and it will also be based on something around Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and one of the mysteries and optional boss fights, the Daughters of Lyrian. If you'd like to stick around for that upcoming episode and the rest of the pieces here at the Rookery's Archives, then please subscribe. I upload every Sunday, even if this episode did go up on a Monday instead. Last week I was also invited onto Let's Talk AC's spoiler-free discussion on what we think about Assassin's Creed Valhalla so far, along with Arshak from AC Landmarks and Andrew from Visions of the Past. It's also linked in the description below if you want to check that out, as are my social media links if you'd like to follow me on Instagram or Twitter. If you have any further suggestions on topics you would like to see me cover in the future or to revisit that I might have hinted before, please comment down below or message me on Twitter or Instagram. My name has been Louise, aka the Nerdy Archer, your resident historian here at the Rookery's Archives, and I hope to see you flying back to the Rookery soon. Happy New Year, everyone!